Professor Tamim, the moderator of this webinar, fellow panelists, Tan Sri Zulkifli, Tan Sri Kamal, Professor Anis. It's nice to see you, Professor Anis, and also Professor Murad. Inshallah, in 20 minutes, inshallah, allotted to me, I will try to discuss a few aspects of the topic, given that the topic is quite broad. There are two major intellectual agendas in the Muslim and developing countries that have been going on since the end of colonial rule. The two agendas or projects are decolonization and Islamization. Actually, the seeds of these two projects, the roots of this project, have been planted much earlier during the colonial rule, because certainly the Muslim intellectuals, Muslim scholars did not stand by idly in the face of colonialism. They reacted against it, fought back, and tried to find solutions to the challenge. But for the purpose of discussion, just talk about these two projects since the end of colonial rule. That means that's more than 50 years ago. Now, with regard to the two terms, Prof. Kamal has already defined them, so there's no need to define again. So thank you, Prof. Kamal. That makes it easier for us who comes after you. The only one thing, I agree with Professor Kamal that from the Muslim perspective, decolonization should really be treated as an integral part of Islamization. However, for this purpose, for my discussion today, I treat the two as distinct, although overlapping, precisely because there are developing countries and there are formerly colonized countries that are not Muslim majority. So I treat them to accept. I'm more interested actually in my presentation not in the two agendas as a kind of parallel to each other or intersecting, but I'm interested more in the intersection of decolonization and Islamization. So it is some highlights of this intersection that I would like to present, given the shortage of time. Most Muslim countries are categorized as developing, and most so-called developing countries are Muslim. Thus, under the widely used criteria of categorization of developing, there is a general identification of Muslim with developing. This itself is an issue in social science. We may want to review this issue of categorization and its criteria, and to suggest new ideas on the global social order by coming up with new classifications of countries that truly reflect the rich cultural diversity of the world, rather than that are based on dubious or disputable assumptions. There's one possibility if we are revisiting this whole issue, whereas we need to think anew on this issue, or we feel we are quite happy with the present categorization, and we then argue that all we need to do is just to improve on our socio-economic performance so that we will transform ourselves from developing into developed countries. But the reality, we know what the reality is. Now, what the implication should be, in other words, I mentioned two possibilities. So whichever one we take, the implications should be both in the short and the long term need to be studied. The study could be undertaken under both decolonization and Islamization. But my view is that the so-called developing countries should not continue to be trapped in an ill-defined global economic agenda that was imposed on them, including this division between developing and developed. Existing forms of relation between developing and developed countries need to be reviewed and redefined. Social scientists have an important intellectual role to play in redefining these relations. So this is the first point that I would like to emphasize. Next, there is the identification of Muslim countries with colonized territories. Most Muslim countries were once ruled by the West, and most formerly colonized territories are Muslim. So this particular identification means that, generally speaking, Muslim countries have undergone both Westernization and de-Islamization. Emphasize de-Islamization. In other words, for Muslim countries, the inevitable consequences of colonialism were Westernization and de-Islamization. The two consequences were visible both at the level of ideas and at the level of institutions. If we bear in mind that European colonialism had civilizational goals, both written and unwritten, namely the unchallenged global reign of the newly installed new value system of modern Western civilization, then we will not be surprised to see the impact of this colonialism on Muslim countries reaching civilizational proportions. Of course, the majority of Muslims fought back against Westernization and de-Islamization. According to Ali Mazrui, rahimahullah, one of Africa's most famous scholars in modern times, who was a leading authority on colonialism, if we are looking for a clash of civilizations in the more recent past in human history, then that historical moment was none other than during Western colonial rule. Mazrui portrayed it as the clash between Islamic and modern Western civilizations, which was essentially a clash between two civilizational value systems. This clash has been studied by a good number of social scientists, but further studies on it in both depth and breadth are needed. Since colonialism had resulted in de-Islamization, it is only logical that decolonization, understood as the undoing of colonialism, would involve some form of Islamization. So we come to this point. We come to this very important point, namely the historical justification of Islamization. In order to appreciate the significance of contemporary Islamization of knowledge, not only in the social sciences but also in many other disciplines, it is important to first understand the significance of de-Islamization during colonial rule. We understand de-Islamization to mean the deliberate attempts by colonial authorities to remove Islamic elements from the indigenous societal institutions, and more importantly, to deliberately erase this element from the Muslim mind or consciousness, particularly through education. Perhaps the most visible de-Islamization misdeeds happen in the field of law. This high visibility of de-Islamization in the field of law, which is higher than in any other field, is hardly surprising, given the centrality of law in society and civilization. This is especially true in the case of Islamic society, where the revealed law or Sharia is believed to be the final embodiment of the divine will to serve as complete guide to human life on earth, individual and collective. All laws of human origin are supposed to be based on or to be extensions of the revealed law. And it is by virtue of that conceptual extension that all laws in Islam are viewed as religious in character. What colonial de-Islamization has done was to perform a surgical operation on the body of the Sharia that was one total whole by amputating its parts that Western doctors of law considered as not religious in the light of their own understanding of religion. Let me illustrate this colonial de-Islamization in the domain of law with a concrete historical example. British Malaya. I owe this illustration to Allahyarham Professor Ahmad Ibrahim, already referred to by Professor Kamal, a noted Malaysian legal authority in both Western and Islamic laws, who was an academic at the University of Malaya in the 1970s and then from the 90s onward at IIUM. He narrated the colonial de-Islamization of law or colonial de-Islamization in law in British Malaya as follows. This is my summary of what was written. Before British rule, the laws in the Malay states were Islamic. That is, those of the Sharia. The Sharia that was then practiced in these states covered all branches of law as befitting its true status as an integral legal system, including family, land, criminal, civil, and evidence and procedural laws. With the coming of British rule, the process of de-Islamization in law began. De-Islamization of law, which in practical terms meant the shrinking of the Sharia, was achieved through two principal ways. First, through treaties between the Malay rulers and the British colonial authorities that required the former to receive advice from the latter except in matters of religion and Malay customs. The Malay rulers were pressured to sign the treaties, which favored the British. The British catch in the treaties was the word religion. In Ahmad Ibrahim's own words, quote, "The word religion of Islam has been given a narrow interpretation, and religion is understood in the same sense as in Christianity. With this interpretation, the British were able to influence the field of law in Malaysia, which they considered as having no connection with religion," end of quote. Following this narrow interpretation of religion, the British were able to reduce the Sharia under the jurisdiction of the Malay rulers to family and inheritance laws and matters pertaining to religious rituals. The British advised the Malay rulers to introduce new written laws to replace the Sharia laws in domains that colonial authorities no longer considered as religious. The new written laws were, of course, based on English laws, either directly or indirectly. Now, the second channel of de-Islamization of indigenous laws was the sentences passed by the judges. The British authorities advised the Malay rulers to establish courts and appoint judges. In practice, all these judges were British, who were well versed with English laws. But whenever they encountered problems during court trial proceedings that could not be resolved through the newly written laws, they often resorted to English laws, because these laws were the only ones they knew and understood. Thus said Ahmad Ibrahim, quote, "Through these two channels, namely new laws and court sentences by judges, English laws were comprehensively introduced into the legal system in the Malay states. Eventually, it could be said that English laws succeeded in practically replacing the whole of Islamic laws as state laws," end of quote. So now we could visualize the intersection of decolonization and Islamization in one of the most important domains in the social sciences. There is the narrative of de-Islamization of law in British Malaya that I presented earlier is rather well known to many people of the older generation. But many young people do not know it. It would be better for them. It would be good for them to know it and have it as an integral part of their evolving consciousness. However, for academics in the social sciences, they need to go beyond the simple acceptance of this historical narrative. They need to reflect on the deeper issues underlying the colonial phenomena of de-Islamization of law in Muslim countries, so that we learn something, historical lessons from this phenomena. Now, only through such a reflection would they be able to clearly see the intersection of decolonization and Islamization. Quite clearly, both decolonization and Islamization may be viewed as legitimate responses to the Islamization of law that necessarily overlap, since issues of religion were closely intertwined with colonial policies. What are the deeper issues underlying the colonial de-Islamization of the Sharia? Not only in British Malaya, but more generally, in all colonized Muslim lands. I would identify three of these deeper issues: British secularism, Christian theology, and British imperialism. Taking British Malaya as a case study, we are persuaded to believe that all the three elements contributed to the de-Islamization of the Sharia. Since the British colonial legacy is still with us, it means that we have not yet successfully resolved the challenges that arose from colonial de-Islamization. In other words, both our decolonization and Islamization projects have not yet achieved their goals, if indeed these goals have been well defined and articulated. Let me explain what I mean by the three deeper issues. First, British secularism. British secularism was an underlying issue in the de-Islamization of law because it fortified in the British consciousness the domain that separated the religious and the secular, thereby influencing their attitudes in a negative way towards the religiosity of the Sharia in the Malay states. The weakening of Christian faith in Europe generally during the colonial period, not just in Britain, in Europe generally during the colonial period, partly due to the influence of science, the whole of science, helped empower British secularism. While Christians had no objections to the religious secular lines of separation, Muslims reacted with fury to the imposition of this dichotomous belief on their thought, since this was foreign to their religious consciousness. Moreover, as a result of the application of British secularism to their legal system, they lost their wholesome Sharia that is yet to be recovered. The other issue is Christian theology. Christian theology was an underlying issue in the de-Islamization of law, since not only it stood by the religious secular division imposed by the British colonial authorities on traditional Malay legal system, but it also facilitated the imposition by virtue of the fact that Christianity had no sacred law in its history in the post-Pauline era, that's the post-St. Paul. Christianity did not and still does not appreciate the centrality of the Sharia as the sacred law in Islam. Christians readily admit that theology is central to their life and thought. To be appreciative of Islam, all they need to do is to realize that, significant-wise, what theology is to Christians is what the Sharia is to Muslims. A Christian attack on the Sharia is comparable or equivalent to a Muslim attack on Christian theology. British imperialism is the third issue. British imperialism is an underlying issue of the Islamization of law because it does not tolerate legal pluralism, let alone the idea of permitting another legal system to challenge the reign and supremacy of English law. Therefore, it was the role of colonial policy to ensure that indigenous laws, to the extent that these were allowed to be practiced, must be subordinated to the English legal system. De-Islamization and the shrinking of the Sharia was just a logical consequence of the British imperial policy on indigenous laws in the colonies. In my view, these three underlying issues have not yet been resolved. They need to be further articulated in contemporary studies on decolonization and Islamization, viewed as responses to colonialism and its legacies. One I would like to say, the rest of my presentation is about, if previously I've talked about basically the intersection, in a sense, the convergence, the convergence of decolonization and Islamization. Here, I would like to say more about the differences, or rather, what separate the two. Of course, assuming that we are not only looking from the view of Islamization, from the Muslim point of view, but from the more general view that includes also the view of non-Muslims who happen to be colonized. Now, apart from historical justification of Islamization, we also have its epistemological justification. As far as Islamization of knowledge is concerned, the epistemological justification is the most important, because it is essentially concerned with issues of knowledge per se. In the case of the social sciences, the epistemological issues are primarily concerned with the nature and characteristics of society in the singular, society in the singular, and of societies in the plural. Concerned with the functional assumptions about human societies. Concerned with the methods of study of societies. Concerned with the purposes of social sciences. These are the core issues that need to be addressed in the social sciences. When we are speaking of the epistemological justification of Islamization in the social sciences, we have to investigate whether or not the core issues in question and related issues have to be, and related issues have been addressed. We have to check, we have to investigate whether these issues have been addressed in the light of Islamic ideas and practices. Prof. Kamal has already done quite a bit on this, but what I just want to point out is that, in other words, as I said, I'm saying that we are talking here about Islamization of the social sciences, which is yet to be achieved. One more to be achieved at the highest level of Islamization. It's still an unfinished business. But what I would like to conclude here is, from the Islamic point of view, in other words, I'm appealing now, I would say something about the intersection between decolonization and Islamization from the perspective of Islam. In other words, my concern is with our scholars, Muslim scholars who are dealing with the subject of decolonization. Well, clearly there are differences in several respects between Islamization and decolonization, understood as intellectual projects. For one thing, the scopes of the intellectual concerns, of the two intellectual concerns, are not the same. Islamization of the social sciences is clearly a broader and more comprehensive, because it is concerned not only with colonialism and its legacies, but also with pre- and post-colonial social phenomena and legacies. For example, we often refer to Ibn Khaldun, who came before the colonial era, but we can learn many things from him, from his work in our study of the phenomena during colonial times and the post-colonial events. But I think, in my view, decolonization as a project of Muslim scholars would gain more, would benefit more if they were to see themselves as also as an aspect of Islamization. In the sense, the two complement. Islamization has universal perspectives. Generally, it has particular perspective, but the perspective is universal. Decolonization is indigenous based. Because it is, as Program used the word deconstruction, because it is a deconstruction, which is easier thing to do than construction. Sorry to scholars of decolonization, but this is my sensibility. Therefore, we find that when we look at the literature on Islamization and decolonization, I could see that the Islamization, in a sense, is better defined than the project of decolonization in terms of foundation, in terms of methodology, in terms of objectives, goals. Islamization stands far above decolonization. And precisely because decolonization is more of an intent, of an intention. Decolonization is an intention to deconstruct, to undo colonism. But having that intention, what is the proposed methodology to run? All right. If decolonization is about the undoing of colonism, what is exactly the methods? What are the methods of undoing that? Well, I think yes, it is true that both Islamization and decolonization are still ongoing, but I think, to close my presentation, I would call that in the Muslim perspective, for the two perhaps to get to merge, or to use a popular saying, all this while proponents of decolonization have made friends with proponents of Islamization. Perhaps now decolonization should get married to Islamization so that they can gain more from that marriage, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.